Hello everybody and welcome to Sonic Talk number 358. Last week was 357. You might have seen my little pun on Magnum there because, you know, feeling lucky. I just thought I had to do it. It was my Dirty Harry. Is it Lalo Schifrin who did the music for that? I think it was, wasn't it? Anyway. It's irrelevant now because now I'm rambling. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to everybody in our fulsome chat room. Yes, I'll say it again. I'll say it proud. We have a lot of people joining us this week. That's great. And also, I'm just about to turn on the live streaming. So if you probably missed this, I'll put that on now so you'll see it on the front page as well for a fulsome, even more fulsome chat room. So I want to say thank you very much to iZotope for sponsoring the show. We have news of last week's winner of iZotope RX3, which we run a competition every week at the moment, and there will be details for how to win your very own copy of RX3 this week, much along the same lines. You will need to have a Twitter account, so you've probably got about 20 minutes to go and sign up if you want to find to be in with a chance. Anyway, so thank you very much. This week we're joined by, we've got a full complement of Skypees. I'm going to start with, let's start with Dave Spears. We haven't seen Dave Spears for a while. Dave Spears there in his synth cave where he collects all manner of analog antique equipment. You always look. I mean, what's wrong with saying that? You've got loads of them. Okay, you're a synth collector. Just say it loud and proud. It's fine. G4 software.
It's that idea of a collector, isn't it?
Okay.
One who sort of collects things and never uses them.
No, well, that's not true. You do use them, though, don't you?
A synth nerd, geek. I don't know. Yes. Anyway, yes. There's more coming.
Whoa! Anything you can talk about? You started buying up NAF 80s digital equipment yet?
Well, weirdly, I did the valuation for probate of a guy, strangely enough, who lived about 5 miles away from here and who sadly died. But the relatives asked me to do a kind of probate valuation. And there was a couple of things in there that we wanted, but we haven't got yet. And actually, they're talking to me about maybe disposing of the collection, which is such a really hard thing for me to do because this guy was completely passionate about sequential circuit stuff. So there's kind of everything from the 5, the Pro 1, 6-track, multi-track, Tom. And and most of them came from wine country or wine county. So I really wanted to keep those as a kind of entire collection, but we didn't. Well, I don't know whether we can do that. I think that might be a step too far. But I did buy. In fact, last week when I wasn't here, we were off purchasing a couple of things. Do you want to see?
Oh yeah, of course I do.
Well, they need some love and care, so they're not perfect yet. But
Jupiter 8. Okay, nice. Are you sure that? Oh, it's a Jupiter 80
and a white face.
Lovely.
Yeah. That's where it went wrong.
Yeah, this is a Jupiter 8e.
Yeah, we paid well over the odds for a Jupiter 80.
Well, it could be collectible. Well, that's really. Have you enjoyed what it could do? Have you been immersed in Jupiter 80ness?
Well, it needs a lot of care. It's not functioning very, very well at the minute. But actually, the guy who sold it to us has a Steiner Parker Synthicon Mark 1 for sale as well.
Blimey.
I have never seen such. He's actually a drummer, and he has. I mean, honestly, I'd be lying if I said there was probably at least 300 kits in his studio.
Wow.
And 1,000 cymbals and things like octagons, Challen piano, Steinway Concert Grand. What else? A beautiful Celeste that I really wanted to walk away with, but we couldn't really. I mean, I could have just spent. Neve, EQs, all the UA preamps. I mean, he literally set out to build his dream studio. And if you think I'm a hoarder, this guy really takes the biscuit.
He's hoarding across multiple categories.
Yeah, so he's downsizing.
Wow, yeah, amazing. Well, one man's downsize is another man's upsize, as they say, or perhaps don't say, but should. Well, anyway, Dave, thank you very much for joining us. Dave Spears, g4software.com, and we're also going to go to... I think I'll say, because we've got Diego Stocco with us, but I'll come to him last because he can then kind of we can go into what Diego's been up to, because that's one of the reasons he's here. I think we'll go back to Rich Hilton, who's now less pixelated and has a much less magnolia and magenta background behind him, because last time we spoke to him, he was in China, somewhere unpronounceable, where he'd just done a Chic gig. So you're back on home turf now, right?
Yes, I'm home.
Rich Hilton, of course, is keyboard player with Chic and also Nile Rodgers' studio guy. So you're back on the usual work routine now, or are you travelling again shortly?
No, we're home for a bit.
Oh, that must be nice.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's actually a really nice time of year here. So, yes.
Cool. Well, glad to have you aboard also, Rich. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll also go to Mr. Mark Tinley, who's, as I said earlier in the pre-show, is looking very professional today. I suppose you could say those headphones were like a different kind of hat. You usually wear a fresh hat for us every week, and this is a pair of headphones. Yep. And is that an Audio-Technica condenser by any chance?
No, it's not. It's a PV.
Oh.
It's very nice, actually.
It
PV,
sounds good.
Something like that. I can't read it. Pro M2.
It does sound good, yeah. You are sounding less, because usually you've got you're holding a kind of Skype telephone to your ear for most of the show, which I imagine is probably a bit tiresome.
It is. But I was doing something earlier, and I entered the Glastonbury Film Challenge, and then I had to do like a voiceover for it. So I set everything up. So I'm going through tubes today.
Wow! So we got a tubed
Still
Mark.
Good.
Yeah, you look like you're about to hit us with some sort of rock vocal. Maybe we'll save that for the end.
Maybe not.
Or maybe not. Anyway, thank you very much, Mark Tinley, of course, music technologist, creative thinker, marktinley.co.uk. And now, finally, we join Mr. Diego Stocco, who's joining us bright and early from the west coast of the United States, where I'm guessing... Actually, you don't look as tired as last time you came on, so I'm guessing the hour has probably in your favour this time, at least, anyway.
I'm getting used to it.
Excellent. Diego Stocco, of course, sound designer.
Hey guys.
I think superstar sound designer, I think is fair to say.
Oh, come on.
Well, you know, in our world, I think it's, you know, I think it's a fair thing to say. Look, you're rocking. What's that behind you? You got a pair of Adams and a pair of Genelecs there, is that?
Actually, those are Genelecs, and the others are it's from this company that I don't know if I think they distribute in the US. It's Easy Eye. The engineer is a friend of mine.
Yes,
and,
ESI, right.
Yeah, and they sound really good. You know, they're kind of unknown at the moment, but I think they will just become more popular by the time people have a chance to try them out.
Is that a ribbon tweeter on it?
Yeah. It's whatever it is. I'm not really. I didn't really see the details, but they sound good. They sound crisp, and they sound they have plenty of volume and everything. This is not the best demo, but description for a pair
Let's
of
just talk about them. I get that.
Forgive me for just because it's kind of early.
That's all right. I tell you what,
I'm not into demo mode.
No, that's no problem. So sometimes people ask us to review speakers. In fact, we've got some at the moment. We've got a pair of Tannoys in, and I always find it sort of difficult to think about how I'm going to do it. I think I did one sort of video review of speakers, but you can kind of just go, look, here they are. They sound like this, and you describe the way that they sound, which you may as well do that in words. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, it's such a subjective feeling about speakers, you know, because you have the major brands, and obviously they have a sound that it's recognizable, and then you have these other brands, and the engineer is a friend of mine, so he explained me why they sound the way they sound and why he thinks they sound great. And even though I don't know the details as he knows them, I agreed with him that they sound good. And I also have the smaller version, which sound good too. You know, they're affordable. You know, they're
excellent. Anyway. Always nice to have affordable speakers. There was a couple of things that I wanted to get out of the way, because I did promise that I'd do this. Champs Original Trend, a store in the I think they're in Holland. We met Champs at the Music Messe, and he did some filming in the dance music fair that was in Utrecht when they released the Roland. You know, the new series of synths, which I can't remember at the moment. Sorry, my head's full of cold, my memory's going. But he basically, I just recently did a review of the IntelliGel Atlantis module, and Champs is a dealer for such things, and he's offered very kindly a special voucher. So if you follow that URL, you get 10% off stuff, and you enter. There's information on that page on how to claim your 10% if you're in Europe and just about to buy some modular. Save 10%. So I thought, as a thank you to Champs, so go and buy some stuff and make us look like we got massive buying power. Anyway, so where were we this week? Oh, I'll talk about what Robbie had to say a bit later on, but. Let's stop. So we'll go back to you, Diego, because you've been really. Oh, that's not you. That's you, number 3, Diego. You've been very busy recently. You've been doing your feed forward sounds, right? You've just released another video about convolution processing, and I'll play a little bit of the video, and then maybe we can talk about all the other stuff that's come out of it. So let me just press the button. And perhaps the video will play. There it goes.
Hey guys, this is a demo of Rhythmic Convolutions, which is a collection of impulse responses I designed specifically for the processing of rhythmic material. Let me show you what it is and how to use it. I'm gonna start with a simple rhythmic track I built in Live. What I'm using here is just for the purpose of this demo. There are several convolution engines available out there, and as far as the initial rhythmic part, it can be anything you want to process. A drum machine, real drums or percussions, beatboxing, even tonal instruments if they have a percussive quality. As you can see, my kick, drum, snare, and hi-hat sounds are on separate tracks, so that each element can be processed in a different way. On the right side, you can see my return tracks, each one containing a convolution engine with a different impulse response loaded in. And if you take a look on the left again, you will see that each element is sent to the return tracks with different levels. I'm gonna activate the returns now.
I'm not going to play all of that, but I thoroughly recommend that you check that out. That's and is that something that you're kind of showing as? I mean, obviously you've got the product, which is the convolution processing, which is a pack of kind of impulse responses, and
Yes.
You've recorded these with your extensive knowledge of and unusual spaces and things available to you.
Well, the video is a demo basically because I did the tutorial that is called convolution processing, and it goes into more details, and also the technique is expanded into other things, to really make it more alive. But I got people asking me, I don't really have the time to create these impulse responses. I see that you explain how to do them, but why don't you just do it yourself? Because you seem to have a lot of sources or whatever. So I came up, I'm gonna do this collection, but I didn't want to do it as just all right. Here's a bunch of input responses. You figure it out how to use it. I was intrigued by the idea of creating them for the processing of rhythmic material, because when you apply them, it creates a lot of additional rhythms inside, and there's a lot of interactions that you cannot really imagine if you play with samples the way they are, because when you play through convolution, it's a multiplication, it's a sum of different events, different elements, different rhythmic elements can go into the same convolution. So it's kind of an inspiring process also for me, and obviously to show and to make people hear how these impulse responses sound. I made a demo, which, I like to do things properly. So I wanted to show them how I set up my own sessions, because I don't use one convolution engine at the same time. I use multiple ones, and I like to play them in real time with them. And so this is what you see in the video.
Excellent. I mean, the thing for me is I actually had no idea that convolutions could be so complicated. I thought that they were just, a pop in a space and that was it. I didn't realize. And that's the thing that I found really interesting. So there are rhythmic elements to the convolution samples that you're creating. That's just, how did you kind of like figure that out and think, hey, this might be interesting, or is that something that's a known thing?
Right. Well, convolution convolution engines are used on a variety of products, and sometimes it's not even advertised, or sometimes it is, because basically you can recreate the impulse response of an amplifier or a room or whatever, and then transform the sound through that. But in this specific case, when I was working on the first video, the video that it's the tutorial, I realized that certain impulse responses, they don't really sound as a reverb, but they introduced some sort of rhythmic interaction with the original rhythmic element. And so I thought maybe I can just expand this element and really see how far I can go. And so I started creating a lot of elements from organic and actual materials like rocks, bricks, pieces of wood, logs, paper. And there's a motion, there's a movement in any of these things. And then when you use them as impulse responses, the original element, let's say the bass drum, it's processed not only in terms of sound, not only in terms of the timbre changing, but also in terms of rhythms added to it, because the impulse response is not just a straight reverb, which is basically a spike and noise following the spike. It's basically fragmented, and you see peaks. And so these peaks are translated and applied over the elements that you're processing.
That's really interesting. Actually, there's a comment in the chat room. Helisphere asks, can you tempo sync impulse responses? Because obviously, if you've got a rhythmic element to that response, how does that work in terms of what you're feeding into it tempo-wise?
Yeah, it is possible, because basically a lot of convolution engines, they have parameters called size, and that size basically it's transposition. It takes the pitch up and down.
So you can tune the size to fit the tempo.
So
is there a direct relationship to that, or do you have to kind of figure it out yourself? You can't do like a quarter note clock sync. Or do you see what I mean?
Well, the convolution engines, they don't really. I mean, the ones available on the market now, they were never really thought as rhythmic tools. So they don't offer a simple way to display, okay, this is your original tempo and this is your tempo that you're going to. So you do it by ear, but it's such an easy thing. And the fact is, when you're tuning it by ear, you are listening. You're not going by a data. So by listening, you might end up with something that you thought, oh, if I just typed in the tempo, maybe I wasn't going to get this, but because you're moving it down or up, you go, oh, I like this.
Moving through it, right, yeah.
Right, it's a more intuitive and musical process,
That's really interesting. I know, Mark, you've been very vociferous about impulse responses and working with odd acoustic spaces, what have you. I mean, have you experimented in using things like in this way? Because like I said, it's something I've not heard of before. I mean, how do you use them?
I never thought to do it with percussion stuff, actually. I have utilized acoustic modeler for imposing the sound of one sound upon another. So in a sort of similar way to that you might use a vocoder to make a voice sound like strings speaking, I've used it to take the sound of someone speaking and make them sound like they're sort of disappearing down some kind of etheric tunnel. It's really, I mean, you can sort of create really good samples using it, and then I create samples and then I lay them across the keyboard and play them. So I've used it for much more ambient things and not for such percussive things.
That's interesting.
And the way it works is, if you do an impulse response of a room, if I do this in this room, you hear lots of early reflections, and it samples each one of those early reflections and creates an event from it, and then it basically takes the reverb tail and creates an event from that. So if you put in the same way that the space you're actually in is percussive, but it's a very tight, very short, very fast rhythm, the early reflections in a room, if you put percussive things into a convolution engine and use them as an impulse response, the convolution engine's just going to kind of recreate it as a massive room with lots of longer reflections in it.
It's very interesting.
But actually, the the way the convolution engine works is the trick in creating impulse responses, the way I found out, is creating them with a correct frequency range. Because when you use a sound that has a certain frequency spike, you're going to end up with a huge resonant peak, and pretty much that's it. I mean, it will just sound unusable, and it will not be really. So even when you record metals, for example, metals are tricky because they are, they have resonant peaks. That's how they sound the way they sound. So the trick is to carve out and to do, multiband compression on the impulse response in a way that when I put it inside the convolution engine, the sound is nice without even doing anything. Then on top of that, you can also apply your own EQ. You can emphasize the high end. So the trick is to really create them in a way where the rhythm comes out and not too much of the frequency peaks.
Okay. So you pre-process it quite extensively.
Well, yeah. Right. There's a lot of work before they are.
If I was going to make an impulse response in a room, one way of making it is to go in there with a starter pistol. If I fire a starter pistol in a room, it makes a sound which has every frequency at roughly the same level, so almost white noise. So the convolution engine is expecting to see something close to white noise. So as Diego says, if you put something in that's got lots of resonant peaks in it in places where it's not expecting to see them, it's going to come out sounding gnarly and weird.
Interesting. And Rich, are you use convolution reverb in your work? I know that because Audio Ease, isn't that convolution? But it's kind of a very high end one. Do you use that kind of stuff?
Yes, I do.
Do you
but not in the ways that Diego is talking about, and not specific to rhythmic oriented applications. But one of the tools I do use that I like quite a bit that gives me a lot to choose from here is called Futzbox. It's by McDSP.
Right.
And he's got convolutions of all kinds of different things. Now, in his case, it tends to be speakery, playbacky kind of things.
Right,
mostly.
so smaller,
not water rushing over rocks or that sort of thing. But so I haven't done any custom convolution recordings for this purpose, but I have applied the ones they've given me to various things that don't involve using it for reverb purposes.
Okay. So that the creation of sort of interesting spaces and almost EQ. It's interesting because you can kind of can you convolute electronics, if you see what I mean, rather than physical?
Yes, and they do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, and they do, and every single kind of speaker known to man, and certain kinds of acoustical spaces and things like that, which do provide some of those changing timbres that Diego's talking about, because as he says, the world is an aesthetic place, and once you start working with live space like that, there is some sort of subtle motion to it.
Wow. So how hard is it to make? I mean, I'm not expecting you to give away any family secrets, but in terms of making impulse responses, do you need specific tools for it, or is it a question of saving the right full file format and importing it into the right, the right program?
Right. Well, by now, this technology has been around enough that there aren't that many secrets out there. A convolution, an impulse response is a technical name that is properly used when there is an impulse and the response, and then the convolution engine uses it to generate a reverb. In my case, they're samples, they're audio files, and they are called impulse responses just to make clear that they are meant to be used in a convolution engine. But the secret, there are companies that create high quality reverbs, and they have their own set of techniques, how they arrange the microphones, which Mark was mentioning the starter pistol. That's one of the ways. Then there are other ways to generate a wide band, white noise impulse response. But in my case, it's about recording elements in a certain way and then carve out frequencies that I know are going to be problematic. Also is about making them that they don't sound too repetitive. So there's some element of randomness in it. So when you play them, you can feel sometimes there's a note, sometimes there's a element that it feels like it's for example, you play it and it feels like it's going through barley,
Right.
and it becomes granular, but
Right.
it doesn't. But it's not mushy like a reverb. You can actually feel the shh kind of thing, and that's the difficult part, because you really have to figure out how to make the input response, because it's always a guess. You say, okay, I record this element, then I process through convolution, and then you play it back and you go,
Not such
it's
a
not
great
the way.
Yeah.
It's not the way I thought, because it's not as intuitive. It's
Right.
You make it and you try it out, and then you tweak
Yeah.
it back until it actually sounds the way you imagined it.
It's interesting. It's almost, it feels kind of similar in a way to vocoding, where you have a carrier and a modulator. It'd be great perhaps if you could get what the world needs perhaps is a real-time convolution engine, so you can feed two real-time signals into them and convolute each other, if you see what I mean. That one
yeah,
that might
yeah,
be,
I know what you mean.
that sounds like it would
But
be
the problem is the CPU, because
Right.
there's calculation. That's why, as far as I know, there aren't convolution engines out there that allow you to modify, for example, the pitch or the size of the input response in real time, because it's calculating in real time.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically the pitch is there, and then there's an incoming signal, which is your dry signal, and it's being processed, but you cannot change the behavior of the input response in real time. There is one one convolution engine from Melda Productions that allow you to add two input responses at the same time, and then cross over between them.
Right, so they're sort of they're pre-calculated.
Like a morph.
And so you can modulate that transition between one input response and the other, and allows you to do more interesting effects. But I think there's room for
it sounds like
experiments
there's
or improvement.
Yeah, definitely.
In the future.
Dave Spears, is there an element of any convolution in any synth modeling, or is it more down to the component level? Because it sounds like, you could almost, if you're convoluting an electronics path, is that a known method in terms of synth modeling? Is that something that you would employ in any of your stuff, or would you go a different route?
You're talking to completely the wrong person, aren't you? Talking to the person who goes, when? Oh, that doesn't sound very good. Can we do that again? Or, that sounds brilliant. How do you do that?
But you don't really want to know, yeah.
There is an element of that. I'm kind of constantly fielding emails and inquiries all day from programmers saying, oh, I'm at this point and I'm at this point. In fact, I replied to one yesterday. He said it was failing in a particular area or something he was working on. I said, it sounds like a pet. It sounds like the name of a pet. And he came back saying, are you calling my software a dog? Which was funny, because I was actually working on a patch which Chris had called Hairy Growler. Which then spawned a whole nother. Anyway, yeah, sorry. No, you are really asking the wrong problem. Wrong person. All of our stuff is obviously component based.
Right, okay.
But I find this really fascinating, actually. I'd just quite like to sit here and listen to Diego talk some more, because I understand the whole rhythmic possibilities of it, but it's one of those things that, having seen it, I go, oh, God, why didn't I think of that? Like pretty much everything Diego comes up with. Like, God, it's so good. Why didn't I think of that? So yeah, I'm just going to be quiet and listen.
Does it sound like that there is... I don't know. I mean, how much processing does one of these things use? I mean, you were showing that, you had a fairly substantial number of instances in your demos there. What were you using in that? I couldn't quite see the name when I looked at it.
The name of that is Convolution Reverb Pro, which is the convolution engine that comes with the Max for Live in Ableton Live.
Right.
And it seems to be working really well. It can handle a lot of CPU. I'm using it on a laptop, so it's not like I'm using a NASA mainframe or anything. The input responses themselves are short, so the length of the input response also determines how much CPU you need, because it's based on the length. Yeah, so the shorter, the easier it is for your computer to handle multiple. And also the longer they are, the mushier and less defined is the sound, because it starts to become it's like multiplying this tiny little impulse on a very long sample. It's like creating a very long reverb. But now when you start to apply a lot of rhythmic elements on top of that, it just becomes undefined.
I see.
But there's one thing.
Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I was going to say there is a way to combine the analog synth world and the convolution processing, because a lot of analog synths, they create this fantastic and really bizarre rhythmic elements that you can create just by twitching knobs and stuff like that. Then if you sample that and you put it inside a convolution engine, you can create an impulse response based on that. So there is a way to join these two worlds. They're not that far,
The possibilities of, I'm just sort of thinking all these. If you had somebody who created a dedicated convolution environment that, so what, it's going to use up half my available CPU, but that's okay because, I could maybe have a dedicated machine for it. You could have real-time stuff, but B, you could almost have like wavetable access. So you're moving around the part of the impulse response that you're using dynamically somehow. There's all sorts of ways you could do.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I mean, I don't think there's a synth out there yet that uses convolution engines. They use convolution technology as a performing instrument. But there is now the technology and the CPU power to create something like that. It wasn't possible 10 years ago, but now it is. You can see how many I use on a single session.
That's very interesting. I do know of a company who are kind of interested in experimenting with audio in that way, and that might bring us on to a point at which it's time to welcome our sponsor. And also, after the particular message, we can get down to the nitty-gritty of the winner of the last competition and the next competition, which I will give out. So I'm going to play the ad and read the stuff. So here it comes. Isotope, of course, sponsors of the show. RX3, which is a complete audio repair system. I mean, it really does have an enormous number of tools. Perfectly suited for audio engineering, recording, post-production, sound design, archiving, broadcasting, forensic and more. You can remove or reduce reverb with vocals, instruments or more, or accentuate it as well, because you've also can take everything in the opposite direction as well with the Dereverb module, clean up dialogue on the fly with the dialogue denoiser. It's a new standard. It's very sort of low impact, so you can do that. You've got all sorts of things with RX3, things like multi-tab documents, so you can do lots and lots of comparisons, and which is very important when you're getting down to the nitty-gritty. Monitor your audio and loudness using Insight, a spectral repair, denoise, declip, declick, decrackle, and more. Pinpoint problems faster with the spectrogram and spectrum analyzer, and easily finesse your sound with dedicated audio enhancement modules like EQ, gain, channel, ops, and pitch and time. There really is an enormous amount to it. And so we're now actually also going to be saying last week we had a competition which was we asked people to tweet out the hashtag RX3 Audio Rescue, and you send it to @SonicNick and also @Isotope Inc. And this week we have a new competition. You can win it. Let's go for the let's have the winner of the last one. I forgot to mention that. The guy is called @Howling Terror, so that's his Twitter handle, and he is the winner of Isotope RX3. So if you make yourself known to me and send me your email address, I can get the Isotope Fairy to bestow the RX3 on you. The Isotope Fairy is in a particularly good mood because she's just come back from holiday. I can verify. So let me just say, this week we're going to be doing the same thing. You can win Isotope RX3 once again. What you need to do is tweet with the hashtag RX3 No More Noise. Seems fairly self-explanatory. RX3 No More Noise, and you want to @SonicNick and @Isotope Inc. And what happens is I get up a little search that basically, looks for that hashtag. And if you fulfill the criteria by mentioning me and by mentioning Isotope, then you get put in a list, and we count. I generate a random number and I count it up from the bottom, so the first one comes in, and that's the person that wins. It's really straightforward. Not very scientific, but fair. Firm, but fair. So please do. And if you want to just check out Isotope RX3, go to isotope.com/RX3, and there's a 10-day demo for all of their stuff. So, go crazy for it. I feel there's still more to say about this. I mean, I don't know what... do you think it's a bit niche, this, Diego? I mean, do you think perhaps that this level of... because, I mean, the stuff that we heard where your stuff, I mean, you're very... there's an experimental aspect to what you're doing, and it's kind of an unusual sound design thing. Is there a sort of, outside of the regular kind of smooth, beautiful reverbs, is there a more, are there other avenues that you can explore that have, or are you just kind of starting to scratch the surface here yourself, do you think?
Well, there's obviously I did 200 of them, and
wow.
They seem to cover, I divided them into 10 families, you know, like I have minerals, liquid glass, that is a combination of liquid movements and glass. And then there's grains, which is sand, barley, sugar. Even me biting on a meringue, they created a very nice
meringue,
crunchy,
nice.
Yeah, crunchy and grainy at the same time. So it wouldn't have been the same if I used an apple, you know.
That's awesome.
So there's a lot to do, you know. Now obviously I kind of figured out a faster way of doing them, because I know what to do when it comes to specific things, and so when I record, I know how to record them, and I know what to fix to make them sound good, because I didn't want to present something that is presented as, and from here you got to do like hours of tweaking. From here you just use them right away. But to answer your question, if this is a niche thing or not, if you think about it, when people buy a plugin, they don't really see what's going on underneath. They just play the sounds and they say, all right, I like it or I don't like it. Because I'm not, you know, able to code a plugin myself, I basically gave you the underneath. I gave you what's underneath, and you can use it in a way that you like on whatever plugin that you might already have. And so I don't think it's a niche thing, because everybody's using sounds to do creative things. There's still a huge room for exploration for, you know, sounds for virtual instruments and stuff like that. This is just a different approach, an approach that I can produce on my own, you know, but
absolutely,
from there,
it also sounds to me like there is, like we've said, you know, there is really room for an instrument that could take some of the things that you're doing and give it even more, you know, legs, you know, do some really interesting things on top of that and make actually your job easier and to do even more kind of crazy and off the wall and interesting things.
Yeah, you know, like in everything, like in every of these things, like virtual instruments, even if it's analog things, there's a certain level of passion that you put behind something, and it allows you to really figure out how to do things, because the technology, it's out there.
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of custom input responses across the years, and they are not presented in the way I present mine. And I think presenting them specifically for rhythmic elements, divided into themes, allow you to basically load them. And you say, okay, I want to make this thing sound like it's coming out of wood. And this is a way to do it.
That's really interesting. Do you, how big in terms of length are these samples? Because you're saying if you make it too long, what we're talking about?
They're small. The whole folder is about 50 megabytes.
Oh, right. So they're kind of very short.
Yeah, because you see, and this is another thing, because there's a lot of products that I see in the market. They go, we present our files in 96 and 100. Yeah, okay. I mean, I can sell you an apple this big. It's still an apple, you know. But if it's a good or bad apple, that's what really matters, you know. And so the size of a file, it's the same thing that came up with the length of my tutorials. People said, well, I don't know if $9.99 it's worth for a 10 minutes tutorial. Well, but if my tutorial doesn't start with, hi, this is Diego Stocco and I'm living in sunny Burbank and today is this kind of time. So, I mean, if I don't use that time to talk about things that make no sense, of course the tutorial is going to be tighter, because it's just
I see what you're saying.
On the thing that matters, you know.
I was more curious actually about how long an impulse response has to be in terms of time to be useful.
It can be a third of a second, it can be a second, but it really depends the kind of effect that you're trying to create with that particular element, because if you're trying to, some of them can be 2 seconds, but they are creating a long tail. So you want to use them and actually use that tail that is coming out of the convolution engine. Otherwise, if you're adding, let's say you're working on a track that is really fast, and you use long input responses, it's going to start to sum up and create confusion.
Right.
So there's a logic in how you use them, you know.
Interesting stuff. Sorry,
it's pretty much, yeah, it's me. It's pretty much the same as putting way too much reverb on everything. If you think of
Exactly,
it as
yeah.
being, if you think of it as being like a reverb, you wouldn't put reverb on it, or really long reverb on everything, because you just end up with a
Right.
complete ununderstandable mess. But you might put lots of early reflection type reverbs on different things. So
Interesting.
think of it like that.
Well, I think our convolution chat has probably reached its end, and I wanted to introduce some other aspects to it and bring some of our rest of our panel in. And one of the things that this just really struck me, because when I was producing various bands and kind of getting involved in recording projects, I remember this whole period of pre-production that was kind of part of the process, and it sort of thought, what's actually happened to that now? Because then it used to be stuff like, you'd rehearse with the band, you figure out the keys, you maybe do some tempo maps, you tighten up an arrangement, and then you go in the studio and you do your thing. It's a very different world now, perhaps, or is perhaps that the same kind of stuff? I was going to start with you, Rich, really, because you're recording stuff on a regular basis. What is the flow of of workflow through the pre-production? How would you understand pre-production, in terms of what you do now?
It all gets wrapped up pretty much together now, so that it is included in the writing process, unless the writing is conducted by a room full of people with instruments in their hands. Then typically, in my world, it's conducted as an interaction with parts that are being recorded to computer.
Right.
Whether it's, creating a rhythm section from the ground up or creating an orchestration from the ground up. So the writing sort of becomes the pre-production, because you're choosing sounds as you go now. It's not just the three guitars the three guys have in the room. It's whatever you have in your computer to adapt to the thing. So if the writer says, I want to hear a Fender Rhodes play underneath me going like this, you put up some kind of Fender Rhodes for the moment. And you know that you can go back and change it later. And if it's, I want to hear, the oboe playing this, then you can pretty quickly get up an oboe and make that happen. So it all kind of gets wrapped up together. And it's not very long into that process that the mixing begins as well, because every day at the end of the process, you have to hear something that sounds like music. It just can't be a random collection of sounds applied to parts. So it's changed. It's not so much of a timeline as it once was, from, pre-production into, recording into embellish. It's all kind of wrapped up into one process now.
That's a very good point. I guess also, Dave, I mean, back in the day when, some of us might have some of our own technology, and then we would go and take it into the studio. We'd do it on our own time in a rehearsal room, which was obviously much cheaper by the hour than going into the studio and being completely unprepared for the process. Whereas, because it all seems to take place in roughly the same place all the time, that maybe is why that process might have changed in entirety. Because, I mean, you don't need to do pre-production for your own things in your own studio, because you're always working, if you see what I mean. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, what's the question?
There wasn't one, really. It was just a sort of introduction, so you could... I don't have to ask a question for everything, surely.
I was just thinking, actually, pre-production always used to start with
Click
winding
tracks.
up one or more of the band members. That was seeing about how far you could push the button before you got told off by usually the tour manager or the promoter going, for God's sake, it's his art, let him do it. Things like sellotaping mark trees up and stuff like that always went down well. No, I mean, it's been a long time since I've been involved in setting up a tour, but I mean, then it was just like Rich said, it was pretty much everything from now. I mean, bear in mind, I'm only really involved with electronic acts now for any of that kind of work. Most of the work's done beforehand. It's literally just kind of making sure that the flow works, that the BPMs are correct, that actually there's no magic, there's no dance where people are going to bump into each other when they're kind of muting and demuting things and moving stuff around. It's really that, and just kind of just honing things really until really the star turn is happy. When the star turn goes, okay, I'm happy. It's usually about the second night of the tour, but you like to try and get that all squared away in production rehearsals.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, you're talking about...
I mean, normally Sorry, in the old days, really, production rehearsals were generally the first time that the band got together with big PA and possibly even lighting. I mean, we'd have lighting production rehearsals and stuff like that, and everything could kind of come together and be coordinated. So again, it was really honing it. Now, particularly with electronic acts, most of that work's already done, you know, during the course of writing the album or collating the tunes to go out live and stuff like that, or collating the stems. So yeah, interesting.
No, it is. I mean, you raise an interesting point. I mean, I was thinking more of the studio experience, but actually, you know, there isn't an awful. I mean, I've done the last my last pre-production gigs have been taking the studio album and making it ready, or, you know, enabling a band to perform it, and that is an incredibly complicated. That's a much more complicated process than just preparing the click tracks and the sounds or whatever. That's why I don't do it.
You can get some brilliant moments out of that, though. You know, actually, I love working. Obviously, I did this Debbie Harry tour a million years ago, and there was this moment where I was kind of sat there with the multi-track, taking the CR78 groove from, say, something like Heart of Glass, and they were real pinch me moments, because you kind of sit there and go, Jesus, you know, if I'd have thought I'd be doing this as a teenager, you kind of go, whoa, and I love that transition from that to, obviously there's a warm-up gig, but the first night of the tour is usually, well, that can be kill or cure, but actually there's a real joy in that either way, because then you understand who the kind of pros are on the tour, and if there is an issue, then they solve those really quickly. And I love that kind of on the fly, and I love working with people who are really accommodating like that. Debbie, for example, was just brilliant. You know, something wasn't happening with something that was driven by sequencers, all of a sudden she could switch to, you know, right, rock and roll mode, okay, do this song, and that for me was just brilliant.
Yeah, I can just bypass it, I suppose. I know, Mark, I mean, I'm guessing you kind of probably dealing with both aspects of that, but when you were working with Duran, I mean, sort of pre-production before you go into the studio, you know, maybe working on demos and stuff so that they're ready to kind of expand in the studio, but then also going out on the road as well, so you get both ends of the process. Do you think that's changed?
I haven't done it for a while, so I don't know how much it's changed. I know some front of house sound engineers, and I think pre-production for them is all about writing everything onto their, is it a wave stick or a USB stick?
Yeah, USB.
Their iLock or whatever, gold iLock or something. So I think pre-production for them is all about actually having the gig completely working, so that you can just go wherever and stick the key in the desk and bang, the whole thing comes up, and then it works in exactly the same way whatever room you're in. But for me it was always about the sounds, getting all the sounds together, sampling things off the multi-track, like Dave was saying, like, you know, the drum box on Planet Earth, or the sample, and actually noticing how the producer who produced that record put those things together, and what things have gone together on what tracks on a 24-track master to condense it down to 24 tracks. That always fascinated me.
Oh yeah.
And for me, my pre-production, if I'm doing anything pre-production, is always about gathering sounds. If I'm ever doing a project, it's always about gathering sounds, finding all the things I want to hear and knowing where they are, and having the machine set up so I can just go, oh, I want a bit of that now. And
yeah, that's interesting. It's maybe maybe you agree, Diego, with a project you create a palette of sounds to then work with, and that's kind of the pre-production, right?
Yeah, I think now the necessity of preparing the studio, it's not as prominent as it used to be, because back then, I mean, not that I was there, but I've been there a little bit, just in between the transition. But obviously, when you needed to prepare a studio, you needed to have everything ready for the recording session. But now you already have the studio at your home, so it doesn't really matter. So I think pre-production in these days is more like a mental process. You think, okay, I'm going to create this, and for this project, I'm going to need this kind of sound. So maybe you do a little bit of browsing through sounds. You start to take a look on the internet to see if there's a new plugin or things like that. I think it's a more like a mental process, because you don't need to justify. I mean, I think pre-production, and you tell me if I'm right, was to justify the costs of going into a studio. You don't want to spend a day in a studio with a studio rate, just to think, oh, should we do this? Should we do that? Did you make this track? Is this ready to roll?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, I guess also, I mean, the other thing, the same, in a similar process, the kind of notion of creating a demo and then doing it again, that seems to have been gone by the way. So I don't know. I mean, I guess, Rich, you must have, the boss must come in with various different sort of noodles and ideas. I mean, he may well be able to remember it all and just play it again, but there must be, when people come in with stuff that then needs to be worked on, I mean, there's essentially that's kind of pre-production, or it's part of the demo process, or is that kind of pretty much, you used to get the A&R guy saying, yeah, great demo, let's do it properly now, so, and that sort of seems to be, that's not really something that happens so much, apart from maybe if you're just doing an orchestral a synthesis orchestral bit just to kind of demonstrate the arrangement and then getting an orchestra to do it.
Well, it also depends on whether you know at the front what you're doing. For example, if you're doing a cover song, you have some model of what you're about to do. If you're beginning a new recording for people, like a pop song, it could come in various stages of preparedness or not preparedness. And I do know there's a story told by Kathy Sledge about when they walked in to sing We Are Family, that the verses, he was still writing the verses in the studio. In other words, some things did get worked out in the studio and benefited from having been worked on in that way. But Diego is absolutely right that for the most part, pre-production involves saving costs and being more efficient when you get to the higher cost place, which is the recording studio back then, and everybody's got their instruments on and tape is rolling.
It's interesting how that process maybe changed, because obviously now you've got two schools. I mean, you've got the kind of maybe the Nashville recording model where the band know the songs and maybe the musicians are so absolutely slick. Your Carol Kay, who could just basically go, all right, there's the chord chart, right, let's cut a record, bang, there we go, and you just rely on the instinct and their ability and their knowledge to pull it off in the moment. Kind of more or less. There's obviously going to be some preparation, but in many cases, if you listen, there was a bunch of documentaries, interviews with Carol, which are fantastically interesting. I mean, she's the woman who's played bass and made thousands, hundreds of records, and just kind of on the spur of the moment, effectively, just turn them into not very good to something memorable. But then you've also got the scenario where everything's prepared and the producer, I don't know, say maybe Eno has a way of doing it where he'll just bring somebody in and also almost obfuscate completely what you actually need to play, so that he'll get something completely unexpected out of the player. And also, and that's, so there's almost you're going in the opposite direction.
Well, it's a great balance that one needs to strike. You do need to let the guy offer you his vision of what he's hearing that you didn't hear. This is one of the most valuable things I learned working with Nile Rodgers, is let the guy give you what he's got first before you start twisting it into what you thought you were going to ask for.
Right.
Because you might get something better than what you thought you had.
Yeah, which is, I guess, the idea of having, that's the point of having a musician in the place. And then, and if it doesn't work out, that's a very interesting idea. I'm just having a look at the topics now. There was another one which was, but I don't think there's perhaps time to do it, which was, it was more a question of, there was a whole series of there was an article about how Eric Prydz, who's a Swedish dance producer, had used there's a snare that he uses, which is a very signature sound, and there was a spoof story that said he was suing like thousands of people for songwriting royalties because they all use the Prydz snare in their breakdown, and essentially it's the snare on beat 4 of a bar that explodes into space, and then you start, it's like a drop down, but there's not a drop down with a big snare anyway. But what was interesting about the whole idea of that is this notion of looking for that sound, that sound which I thought those days were sort of over a little bit, because everybody could get pretty much every sound that was already created, unless it's massively complicated to create. And it made me think, well, what is it that what is it about a sound or a moment within a record that makes it almost, it's not a sample, but it's a signature that other people want to emulate all the time, and it's kind of okay to do that, because we talked a little bit about sampling D50s and what have you, and there's a really sort of blurred line between all that. And I'm going to go to you, Dave, because you tell that great story about finding the snare, that the Fairlight snare, you're auditioning thousands of them or whatever. Is there a when you hear a sound, sometimes you go, oh, that's going to be big. Do you know what I mean? You expect to hear all that production technique. You can expect to hear it. I mean, it's hard to make anything that fresh these days, but there must be a way of doing it, surely.
Blimey.
Just a little kind of, not too broad a topic.
Well, it's interesting in that, obviously we've been doing the Mellotron stuff for years, and in fact, I did a thing for Music Radar a couple of weeks ago. I think it was only announced. Sorry. They just asked a couple of really interesting questions actually, and it was about this retro. Is this whole retro fetishism, has it got completely out of control, and is it just a kind of fantasist's dream, or is there any kind of validity in it? And I think there is, because, and somebody else who was on there raised an interesting comment, and that was about the fact that some of these tones appear nostalgic, or they are nostalgic, and it's that nostalgic element that, and it sort of mirrored what we'd had with the Tron when we were doing stuff through retail and Guitar Center in America. What a lot of the salespeople were coming in saying that they'd heard that flute sound, but they didn't know what the instrument was. They wanted that sound, so they'd actually come in with a kind of MP3 player and maybe Strawberry Fields or something on it and go, "What's that? What's that?" And I thought that was really interesting, in that there was this entire generation who were obviously, younger than me, who'd grown up without the knowledge of that sound is that. And when this topic came up, and obviously this snare, and you do hear, the repeated sounds over and over again, and I wondered at the time whether it's to do with, particularly with dance stuff, let's say it's a great holiday you're having, and you go to this club and there's a particularly banging tune, and and for some reason it lodges in your psyche, and it's just the tones that are associated with that when you hear it again, I don't know, it just sort of stirs something from within. But then on the other hand, I have to temper that with, when I do patches for synths, sometimes you can come up with a patch and you go, that's new, that sounds fresh, it sounds really original, but everything for me boils down to, is it playable musically? And sometimes that's where I start to feel old, because I'm always approaching it from, if I sit in front of a keyboard and play along with a patch that I've created, if it doesn't work for me, I'll try it on 2 or 3 different keyboards. If it doesn't work for me dynamically and all the rest of it, then it probably goes on the kind of also ran. But when I find, and I have found a couple in the last week of something we're working on, and I've gone, there's a magic about that sound, and I don't know what it is, but for me it's the playability and the emotional appeal of it. So yeah, that's all I can tell you really.
Well, no, that's a very good, well put case. It's interesting because there was a lot of, speaking of playability, there was that whole period of where, and there still is that kind of chord sequence, which is effectively transposition of a sampled chord, which is what we're hearing a lot in that. There is a 3-chord sequence which is derived from that whole thing in the sort of 90s, where you'd sample a triad or maybe another chord and just play it over 1, 3, 5. And it would have that sequence of events, and now we're hearing that, with fifths and what have you. But anyway, Diego, you are a sound designer. That's your thing. Are you kind of trying to find that hit? I mean, obviously, as a sound designer, if you release a library and it becomes the one that everybody wants to score film music, say, for instance, because contact libraries can be hits like that as well, can't they? You get string libraries and what have you. I mean, is that what you're trying to find when you're making stuff, or is it just? I mean, obviously, it'd be nice because you want to have a million selling sound library, but is that what drives it, or is it the artistic side of it more?
Well, there's 2 things. One is to connect with the article, there was a legal aspect, and the legal aspect is way too wide even to consider, because you need to know all the facts before even making a judgment or having an opinion. But then there's another aspect, which is the ethical, or let's say emotional attachment that an artist can have to a certain sound he created, or he developed throughout the years by listening to other things. But there's another aspect that is very important to mention in dance music, which is the function a certain sound has. In dance music, there are moments that need to happen because people dance in a certain way. They expect a certain piece to have a certain arch. So when you say, well, you sampled this, well, when you copied this particular thing, did you actually copy just the sound, or did you copy an entire frame of how dance music actually works? And in my case, for example, I never really started with the thought of, okay, now I'm going to create a sound that is going to become a signature sound. I think it happens the way that Dave was saying. You create something and you go, wow, you know what, this one is actually different. It gives me something. And then people start to like it and they start to use it. There are sounds that I did for Atmosphere and then Omnisphere that they were not treated by me as, oh, this is gold, so this is special, this is different, and so I shouldn't even release it maybe. They're all sounds, you know. They're all sounds. I'm creating this today, and today maybe it was a lucky day, and that sound happened to be more recognizable. But I don't even think it's a good starting
or even
point.
put into the right set of hands and used in a way that, you know.
Right. But Dave was mentioning the playability, and this aspect today, and again I mentioned that the example of dance music, playability might not be the factor. The function of that sound might be the factor. So that snare that drops and then creates an opening for people to, you know, and then
put their hands in the air.
beat. You know, yeah, exactly. There's a function more than a playability,
right.
and it's interesting to see how things evolve. You know.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, Mark, because you in your past you've been very much involved in the dance music scene, you know, kind of on the cutting edge of that, and you know, sound, as you've spoken, you're very particular about, like the 303, for instance. You know, it has to be exactly right. I mean, is there? Do you still find
something to do? Well, it's something to do with the texture, and I don't even know what it is. It's the way it tickles your inner ear. I suppose that's going to sound weird, and it has. I disagree with Dave. It has nothing to do with playability. It has something to do with something in the sonic structure of the sound that does something to you. I definitely agree with him that it's an emotional thing. There's a response to some sounds where you just go, oh, wow, what's that? And I tend to like go through all my sound libraries and favorite those sounds and pull them out. And whenever I write a track with a lot of those sounds that I've gone, you know, that is the sound, that is the sound, that is the sound, it mixes itself. I don't have to sit there tweaking EQs or mucking around with plugins or anything. In fact, my S1000 library just used to be constructed of those sounds, and I could throw any combination of them together and it sounded like somebody had put effort into mixing the track, and really I hadn't, to be honest.
Well, you put effort in
they
somewhere.
Not even have ended up, yeah, well, the effort goes in the choice of the sounds. I suppose it feeds back into the earlier topic about pre-production. But so, I mean, sometimes like those sounds, you find a sound, you press a key and you hold it down, and it does something all by itself. That's you know, the kind of sound I would. So and then I'm going to just jump back to the topic as well. I mean, we're talking about that snare sound, but what about the big gated reverb tom sound that Phil Collins invented? Because that is on everything from the 80s onwards. Now, if he turned around and said, I want to patent that technique for creating a big kind of gated reverb drum ending behind toms, I mean, he could.
I wouldn't. Yeah, God, that'd be an interesting notion whether you could actually do that. Yeah, I don't.
But there's something interesting, something useful actually that needs to be mentioned. And in a way, I'm going to defend Dave, even though he doesn't need me defending. But when you are working on an instrument for other people to play, playability is very important. Because, for example, in Omnisphere, yes, there can be a sound that it's great, but if it doesn't translate musically, what is gonna? I mean, people. It's not like a record that you listen to. You gotta play with that sound. So playability is very important, and also I think it makes sense for Dave. When you have a great sound, does it translate? Does it transpose well? Does it make sense? Because in my hands, I have my own style in my work. But what if I give it to you and you have a completely different style? Can you get something out of it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not musical. I tend not. Well, I occasionally make sounds for other things, but I tend to I tend to create sounds which I can come back to impressive key and go, oh yeah, I know what that meant. So it doesn't necessarily need to be
It is very interesting. It is very interesting what you were saying, Diego, about the function, because, you know, and I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why we've have this progression of fifths. Very often that chord progression is the first and the fifth, and the fifths, obviously, you know, if they're in the right key and what have you, have a very uplifting feel to them. So there's a sort of, there's a built-in atmosphere, and it's almost going back to, you know, just the pure harmonic theory, and people are, it's being distilled down to kind of, you know, it's almost like there's just one note that'll work and everybody go, ooh, it has to have that one note. But it is, isn't it? It's kind of this distillation of the entire musicality of stuff, but also, you know, things evolve too.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of DJs, a lot of producers, they basically apply theory out of experience, out of seeing people reacting or not to a certain thing. When, you know, 100 years ago, these notions were learned on paper. Now they are learned by seeing
instinctively.
These people are actually enjoying it. They're responding to it, so it works.
Yeah. Oh, there's tons of that. I'm sure, Mark, this would be fascinating for one of your sound workshops. The notion of
absolutely.
But yeah, I'd love to. It'd be great to explore it more frequently, but more in depth. But unfortunately, we have to go, or at least I have to go. I can't speak for you all, but seeing as I've got the electronic switch in my hand, I guess that means we have to terminate the broadcast. But thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. That was really interesting. And just want to say before I go, actually, I'll just reiterate that iZotope competition. Yes, remember, you can win iZotope RX3, RX3 No More Noise, hashtag at Sonic Nick and at iZotope Inc. If you send that to Twitter, I've got a little search that will find it and create a list of potential winners, and you could possibly win iZotope RX3 by next week. So I want to say thank you everybody for coming. Thank you Diego for getting up early I know you're on the West Coast and joining us. Been a pleasure as ever. Always good to have you on. And don't forget, you can go and get Diego's stuff at his Feed Forward Sounds video series and the Convolutions at Diego Stocco. All the links are there, diegostocco.com, right?
Yeah, because I also added the PayPal option, which was a popular request. I couldn't figure it out earlier, but now I did. So if you go on my website, from there you will see the different posts with the links. Well, thank you for the opportunity to pitch this thing.
That's all right. Thank you very much for coming. And also on the slipping over a mere 3,500 miles to the other side of America, the US of A, there's Rich Hilton. Thank you very much for joining us too. Really appreciate it. And also for making the effort to come from China last week. That was one of those kind of great moments straight off stage.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. And thanks, Diego. I really love your work, man.
Thanks, Nick. thanks, Rich. Thanks.
And of course, we got Dave Spears over there. Thank you very much for joining us. How frustrating is it to have a Jupiter 8 there that you can't use because it doesn't work? On a scale of 1 to 10.
It's about, at the minute, it's about a 6. I mean, we knew it wasn't going to be perfect, but 7 of the voices work, 1 doesn't, and something got dropped on it at some point. So some of the sliders are looking like that instead of nice and perpendicular. And anyway, I'm taking it to Mr. Kent Spong tomorrow, and hopefully he's going to work his magic on it in the next 48 hours.
I'm sure. At least it's not going to break your back, I suppose. And that's the thing. It's not like it's lugging a CS80 down the stairs, right?
No. And he actually kind of does Skype stuff for us now, like poke that, flick that, whack that, take that card out and hit it with a stick. So yeah, that's a relief.
That sounds like a brilliant way.
I've got a Wurlitzer that's kind of dying over here, and I'm like, I don't want to lug that down the stairs.
I've got a Wurlitzer here as well, which is dead. So yeah, I think it's the power supply, but we'll get through it. Anyway, Dave, thank you very much for joining us. It's been too long. I know you've been busy, and keep an eye on what G4 Software are up to, g4software.com for your instrument needs. And Mark Tinley over there in his kitchen with the fabulous professional setup this week. Thank you very much. I think somebody commented in the chat room earlier on at the start of the show that you might have been using Ben Stiller's hair gel, which I thought was a great comment.
I see. Okay.
I don't know what that means exactly. I think it's anyway. But Mark, thank you very much for joining us. marktinley.co.uk.
You're very welcome.
Are we going to see more of this? Are you going to bring this out for next week as well, or next time you're on?
Oh, maybe not, actually. I mean, the one thing I noticed about microphones is that whenever I want to do anything with a microphone, I've got to find all the things that relate to that, right?
That's true.
So tube preamps and XLR things, and I coil all these things up and I put them away. And since we've moved house, the majority of it is, half of it's in storage and the majority of it's lost under the sofa. So I actually bought a Behringer C1U, which is a USB microphone, which you just plug in the computer and it just supposed to work. So maybe I'll try that next week and we'll see if it does, because it just strikes me that it could be useful to do that.
Well, that's what I sometimes use one of those for a podcast guest, except mine's just the XLR version. But yeah, they're all right. They're a little bit noisy, but, you know, they're not very expensive. So is that everybody? Have I said goodbye to everybody? I think I have. Well, that's it for this week. I'm now going to press the fade to black. I feel like the guy on children's TV in the UK who used to do a special request where he turned the lights off. Here we go. I'm turning the lights off. Goodbye. Thanks to everybody in the chat room as well.